Mia Johnson was no ordinary woman. Her life was a tapestry of quiet strength woven with threads of resilience, an experience that few could ever hope to match. A former operative in an elite special forces unit, Mia had spent over a decade serving her country in the shadows, handling missions that demanded both razor-sharp precision and an unwavering moral compass. She had seen the darkest corners of the world, places where hope was scarce and justice was nothing more than a distant dream. But despite the chaos of her past, Mia had managed to rebuild a semblance of normalcy after leaving her covert career behind. Now, she channeled her energy into something entirely different, teaching self-defense to women in her community, helping them find strength in themselves and empowering them to stand up against the violence that so often threatened to silence them. It was her way of repaying a debt to the world, a way to turn her own survival into something meaningful for others. Mia's life, however, was not just defined by her mission to help others. At the center of her world was her 8-year-old daughter, Leila. Leila was her light in the darkness, a reminder of everything good that life had to offer. With her bright eyes full of curiosity and a mind eager to learn, Leila embodied all the innocence and potential that Mia sought to protect. The two of them shared a special bond, forged in quiet moments at home and playful outings to the park. Leila adored her mother, though she didn't fully understand the scope of Mia's past. To Leila, her mom was a superhero, strong, fearless, and capable of anything. It was on a crisp, sunny Saturday afternoon that the two decided to visit Jefferson Park, a sprawling urban green space nestled in the heart of the city. The park was their favorite escape, a place where Leila could run free and let her imagination take flight, while Mia enjoyed the rare peace of watching her daughter simply be a child. Today they came armed with a picnic basket, a well-worn frisbee, and a pair of hiking boots for exploring the park's lesser-known trails. As they strolled through the main plaza, filled with the hum of laughter and chatter from families and joggers, Mia felt a rare moment of contentment. For once, life seemed uncomplicated. Yet, even as she walked, Mia's finely tuned instincts never fully relaxed. Years of training had made her hyper-aware of her surroundings, and today was no different. Her eyes flicked briefly to a group of 3 men sitting on a bench near the edge of the plaza. They were dressed in plain clothes, nothing overtly suspicious, but something about their body language caught her attention. They weren't engaging with the carefree atmosphere around them. Instead, they seemed to be scanning the crowd with a focused intensity. One of the men, a tall and stocky figure with a close-cropped haircut, appeared to be the leader. He spoke quietly into a device in his hand, his gaze narrowing as he briefly looked in Mia's direction. Mia didn't react outwardly, but her mind immediately began to assess the situation. Were they undercover cops? Private security? Or something else entirely? Her gut told her to be cautious but not to draw attention. She placed a hand on Leila's shoulder, gently steering her toward the park's quieter trails. "Let's check out the creek today," Mia suggested with a smile. Leila's eyes lit up, and she eagerly nodded, clutching her frisbee as they headed away from the crowded plaza. As they moved deeper into the park, Mia's senses remained heightened. She glanced back occasionally, pretending to adjust her ponytail or check her phone, and noticed that one of the men had risen from the bench and was now following at a casual distance. The sight of him sent a cold spike of adrenaline through her veins. He wasn't just wandering in the same direction, his movements were deliberate, and his pace adjusted subtly to match theirs. Mia kept her composure, knowing that any sign of alarm could escalate the situation. Instead, she began mapping out the terrain in her mind, recalling the layout of the park and noting potential routes of escape. Leila, blissfully unaware of the growing tension, chattered on about school, and a science project she was excited to start. Mia listened with one ear, her other senses focused entirely on their surroundings. As they reached the creek, she slowed their pace, letting Leila skip ahead to toss pebbles into the water. The man trailing them stopped a short distance away, pretending to examine a nearby map display. Mia's jaw tightened. Whoever this man was, he was clearly interested in her, and not in a benign way. Then she noticed something else. 2 more men, the same ones from the plaza, had appeared further down the trail. They were positioned as if to block her path should she try to move forward. Mia's mind raced as she pieced together what was happening. This wasn't a coincidence. These men had deliberately followed her and Leila into a more secluded area of the park. The question was why. Were they after her because of her past, or was this some kind of random, targeted harassment? Whatever the reason, she knew she couldn't afford to wait and find out. Mia called Leila back, crouching down to meet her daughter's gaze. "Sweetie, I need you to listen to me carefully," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We're going to play a little game, okay? I want you to stay close to me and do exactly as I say. Can you do that for me?" Leila looked confused but nodded, trusting her mother implicitly. Mia straightened up and took her daughter's hand, leading her back toward the main trail. She deliberately walked past the man near the map, her body language confident and unyielding. If they wanted to confront her, they would have to do it on her terms. As they passed the man, he fell into step behind them, his intent now unmistakable. Mia's heart pounded, but her mind remained clear. She guided Leila toward a fork in the trail, one path leading back to the crowded plaza and the other veering into a densely wooded area. Without hesitation, Mia chose the latter. She knew the plaza would be safer in theory, but it would also trap them in an open space where these men could easily corner them. The woods offered cover and the advantage of terrain, which Mia knew how to use better than most. As they entered the forested area, Mia tightened her grip on Leila's hand and quickened her pace. Behind them, she could hear the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path, more than one pair. The men were closing in, their pursuit no longer disguised. Mia glanced around, noting the dense underbrush and uneven terrain. If they thought they had the upper hand, they were about to find out how wrong they were. As Mia and Leila moved deeper into the wooded area, the sounds of the bustling park faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The gravel path beneath their feet narrowed, and the canopy above grew denser, casting long shadows over their route. Mia kept her pace steady, refusing to show any sign of panic, though her mind was racing. The men were following closer now, their footsteps no longer masked by pretense. It was clear they had dropped any facade of casualness. This was deliberate, intentional, and she was the target. Leila, clutching her mother's hand tightly, glanced up with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Mom, why are we walking so fast?" she asked innocently, her voice cutting through the quiet woods. Mia forced a reassuring smile, even as she felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're just playing a game, sweetheart," she said, her tone calm but firm. "We're seeing how fast we can make it through the woods. Can you be my little helper and keep up with me?" Leila nodded, her trust unwavering. She skipped slightly to match Mia's pace, the small movement sending a pang through Mia's chest. She hated that her daughter had to be involved in this, hated that she couldn't protect her from the reality of what was happening. But right now, survival was all that mattered. Behind them, the crunch of footsteps grew louder. Mia's sharp instincts told her the men were no longer trying to mask their approach. They were gaining confidence, emboldened by the isolation of the woods. Mia quickly scanned the area for options, her trained mind analyzing the terrain. She spotted a narrow break in the trees ahead, a potential exit off the main path. It would lead them further into the forest, away from any predictable routes the men might expect them to take. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than walking straight into a confrontation. She turned to Leila, crouching down briefly to meet her daughter's gaze. "Listen to me, Leila," she said, her voice dropping just enough to convey the seriousness of the moment. "We're going to take a little shortcut, okay? But I need you to stay close to me and hold my hand the entire time. Can you do that for me?" Leila nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. "Is it still part of the game?" she asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. Mia gave her a small smile. "It's still part of the game," she replied. "You're doing great, my little adventurer." With that, she guided Leila off the main path and into the underbrush. The transition was immediate. Branches clawed at their clothes, and the ground beneath them became uneven and littered with roots. Leila stumbled slightly, but Mia steadied her, her grip firm and protective. Behind them she heard the sharp rustle of movement as the men realized their quarry had veered off course. "They're leaving the trail," one of the men muttered, his voice carrying through the quiet forest. Another voice responded, low and commanding. "Stay on them. We'll cut them off." Mia's jaw tightened. They were organized, coordinated. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic thugs. They had a plan. The realization only sharpened her resolve. She pushed forward, guiding Leila through the dense forest with a precision born of years of training. She moved quickly but deliberately, avoiding obvious paths and creating as much distance as possible between them and their pursuers. After a few minutes of navigating the dense foliage, Mia spotted a large fallen tree up ahead. It was thick and wide enough to provide temporary cover. She slowed her pace, crouching down behind it and pulling Leila close. "We're going to take a quick break here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Leila's breathing was quick and shallow, but she nodded, trusting her mother completely. Mia glanced back the way they had come, her sharp eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The men weren't far behind. Through the gaps in the trees, Mia caught a glimpse of one of them, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with purpose. He was scanning the area, his eyes sweeping the forest like a predator hunting its prey. Mia's mind raced as she considered her options. She needed to buy them more time, create a diversion that would throw the men off their trail. Her eyes fell on a cluster of loose rocks nearby, partially hidden beneath the fallen tree. An idea began to form. Carefully, she picked up a handful of the smaller stones and tossed them into the distance, aiming for a thicket of bushes about 20 feet away. The rocks landed with a series of sharp cracks, the sound echoing through the forest. The men immediately reacted. "Over there," one of them shouted, gesturing toward the noise. Two of the men changed course, moving toward the bushes with their focus entirely diverted. Mia seized the moment. She grabbed Leila's hand and whispered, "Stay quiet and follow me." They slipped away from their hiding spot, moving further into the forest. The diversion had bought them precious seconds, but Mia knew it wouldn't last long. These men were professionals. They would regroup quickly once they realized the noise was a ruse. As they moved, Mia felt a sudden shift in the air, a subtle but unmistakable change that sent a chill down her spine. The forest had grown eerily silent, the usual hum of birds and insects replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. Mia's instincts screamed at her that something was wrong. She stopped abruptly, pulling Leila close and motioning for her to stay quiet. A voice rang out from the shadows, smooth and confident. "Impressive. You've got skills, I'll give you that." Mia's heart sank as a figure stepped into view. It was the tall man she had spotted earlier, his broad frame cutting an imposing figure against the backdrop of the trees. He was alone, but his posture radiated authority. This was the leader. Mia positioned herself between the man and Leila, her body tense and ready. "Who are you, and what do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. The man smirked, taking a step closer. "You know exactly who I am," he replied. "And you know why we're here." Mia's mind raced as she tried to decipher his words. Did they know about her past? Were they after her because of her time in the Special Forces? Or was this about something else entirely? The man seemed to sense her hesitation and chuckled. "Don't worry, this isn't personal," he said. "We're just here to clean up a loose end. You're the one who made it personal when you decided to run." Mia's eyes narrowed. "If it's not personal, then let my daughter go," she said, her voice laced with steel. "She has nothing to do with this." The man tilted his head, as if considering her words. "Sorry," he said finally. "Can't do that. Orders are orders." Before Mia could respond, the man lunged. His movements were quick and calculated, but Mia was ready. She stepped to the side, using his momentum against him and driving her elbow into his ribs. He stumbled, momentarily winded, but recovered quickly, his expression darkening. "You've got fight in you," he growled. "Good. This'll be fun." Mia didn't wait for him to make the next move. She grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, wielding it like a makeshift weapon. The man circled her, his eyes cold and calculating, looking for an opening. Mia could hear Leila's sharp intake of breath behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Her focus was entirely on her opponent. The fight was swift and brutal. Mia's movements were precise, every strike calculated to disable and disarm. The man was strong, but Mia's experience and training gave her the upper hand. Within moments, she had him on the ground, his arm twisted painfully behind his back. She leaned in close, her voice low and dangerous. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with," she hissed. The man smirked through gritted teeth. "This isn't over," he said, his tone dripping with defiance. Mia didn't respond. She released him with a sharp shove, grabbing Leila's hand and pulling her away. They disappeared into the forest, leaving the man lying in the dirt, defeated but not broken. Mia knew this was far from over, but for now they had bought themselves a fleeting moment of safety. Mia moved quickly through the dense forest, her hand gripping Leila's tightly as they weaved between trees and leapt over uneven terrain. Her breathing was controlled, but her mind was racing. The encounter with the tall man had confirmed what she feared. This wasn't a random act of harassment or some misguided attempt at law enforcement. These men were after her, and they were professionals. Their intent was clear. They were there to eliminate her, and they had no qualms about involving her daughter. That realization was both terrifying and enraging. Mia couldn't afford mistakes, not with Leila's life on the line. The forest around them grew darker as the canopy thickened, blocking out what little sunlight remained. Mia could feel the terrain shifting underfoot, the soft forest floor giving way to rockier ground. She recognized this part of the park. It led to an old maintenance shed that hadn't been used in years. It wasn't much, but it would provide temporary shelter and a chance to regroup. She steered Leila toward it, her grip on her daughter's hand firm but comforting. "Mom, are those men going to hurt us?" Leila asked, her voice trembling as she struggled to keep pace. Mia's heart ached at the fear in her daughter's voice, but she couldn't let it show. She glanced down at Leila, offering a reassuring smile. "No, sweetheart," she said, her tone steady. "I won't let that happen. I promise." The words were both a comfort to Leila and a vow to herself. They reached the shed a few minutes later, its weathered wood blending into the surrounding forest. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Mia pushed it open cautiously, scanning the interior for any threats. The shed was small and cluttered with old tools and rusted equipment, but it was empty. She guided Leila inside and shut the door, securing it with a heavy metal bar she found leaning against the wall. "Okay, Leila," Mia said, crouching down to her daughter's level. "We're going to rest here for a moment, but we have to stay very quiet. Do you understand?" Leila nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and trust. Mia pulled her into a brief hug, whispering, "You're so brave, and I'm so proud of you." She felt Leila's small arms tighten around her neck, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. Mia stood and began assessing their situation. She needed a plan. Staying in the shed was not a long-term solution, it was too exposed, and the men would eventually find it. She needed to create distance between them and their pursuers, but doing so with Leila in tow added another layer of complexity. Her daughter's safety was her top priority, which meant Mia couldn't rely on the more aggressive tactics she might have used in her past life. She had to outthink these men, using the terrain and her training to her advantage. As she considered her options, she heard the faint sound of voices outside. The men were close, their low murmurs carrying through the trees. Mia froze, motioning for Leila to stay silent. She moved to one of the small windows, peeking out cautiously. Through the foliage, she could see two of the men approaching, their movements deliberate and coordinated. One of them carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, while the other held a flashlight, sweeping it across the forest floor. They were closing in on the shed. Mia's mind raced. She needed to distract them, draw them away from the shed without revealing her or Leila's position. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use. Her gaze landed on an old canister of oil sitting on a shelf. An idea began to form. She grabbed the canister and carefully poured a small trail of oil leading from the shed's back door into the dense underbrush. Then she found an old rag and stuffed it into the spout, creating a makeshift wick. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. "Leila," Mia whispered, kneeling beside her daughter, "I need you to stay here and stay very quiet. No matter what you hear, don't open the door unless I tell you to. Can you do that for me?" Leila hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes, but she nodded. "I'll be right back," Mia promised, squeezing her daughter's hand before slipping out the back door. Mia moved quickly but silently, her footsteps barely audible on the forest floor. She crouched low, staying hidden as she made her way to the trail of oil she had created. Pulling a lighter from her pocket, a habit left over from her field days, she ignited the rag in the canister and gave it a hard shove, sending it rolling down the trail. The flame caught the oil, creating a small but dramatic line of fire that snaked through the underbrush. The light and heat would draw the men's attention, giving Mia a chance to reposition. The plan worked. She heard the men shout in alarm as the fire caught their eye. "Over there," one of them yelled, and they immediately changed direction, moving toward the flames. Mia used the distraction to circle around, heading back toward the shed from a different angle. She needed to retrieve Leila and move before the men realized they'd been tricked. As Mia approached the shed, she froze. A third man, the leader she had fought earlier, was standing near the front door, his posture tense and alert. He hadn't been with the others, which meant he was likely guarding the area while his team investigated the fire. Mia's mind raced as she analyzed the situation. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation. The noise would alert the others. Instead, she needed to take him out quietly and efficiently. She crept closer, staying low and using the trees for cover. Her movements were deliberate, each step calculated to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. When she was within striking distance, She grabbed a thick branch from the ground and swung it with precision, striking the man across the back of the knees. He collapsed with a grunt, and Mia was on him in an instant, pinning him to the ground and covering his mouth to silence him. "Stay down," she hissed, her voice cold and commanding. The man struggled briefly, but Mia applied pressure to a nerve point on his wrist, forcing him to go still. "If you make a sound, I'll make sure you can't walk out of here," she added, her tone leaving no room for doubt. The man's eyes widened, and he nodded reluctantly. Satisfied, Mia used a length of rope she found nearby to secure his hands and feet. She gagged him with a strip of cloth, ensuring he couldn't call out for help. Mia quickly returned to the shed and opened the door, finding Leila huddled in the corner. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, helping her daughter to her feet. "We have to move." Leila didn't ask questions, her trust in her mother absolute. They slipped out the back door, Mia leading the way as they disappeared into the forest once more. The fire had begun to die down, but the smoke still lingered, providing additional cover as Mia navigated through the trees. She could hear the men shouting in the distance, their voices growing more frantic as they realized they had been deceived. Mia pushed forward, her mind focused on finding the next safe point. She knew the park's terrain well and remembered an old ravine that could serve as both a hiding place and a potential trap for their pursuers. They reached the ravine a short time later, its steep walls cutting sharply into the earth. Mia helped Leila climb down, her own movements quick and efficient. At the bottom, she found a small alcove hidden behind a cluster of rocks. It wasn't perfect, but it would provide cover. She guided Leila into the alcove and crouched beside her, listening intently for any signs of pursuit. The forest was eerily quiet, the shouts of the men growing more distant. Mia allowed herself a moment to breathe, her mind racing as she considered their next move. They couldn't stay in the ravine for long, it was too exposed, but for now it would give them a chance to regroup. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Leila asked, her voice small but steady. Mia looked at Orta, her heart aching at the fear she saw in those young eyes. "Yes, we're going to be okay," she said firmly. "I'm going to keep you safe, I promise." But even as she spoke the words, Mia knew the fight was far from over. The men weren't going to give up, and the stakes were higher than ever. She didn't know who had sent them or why, but one thing was certain: they had underestimated her, and they were about to learn just how big a mistake that was. Mia crouched low in the alcove at the base of the ravine, her back pressed against the cold, damp rock, her arms wrapped protectively around Leila, who leaned into her mother's chest, seeking comfort and safety. The forest was unnervingly quiet now, the eerie silence amplifying every rustle of leaves and distant crackle of twigs. Mia's heart beat steadily, her breaths controlled, but her mind was racing. She needed to evaluate her next move. This temporary haven had bought them time, but it was far from secure. She knew the men wouldn't abandon their pursuit. They were professionals, and failure wasn't an option for them. Whatever their mission was, Mia and Leila were the targets. The ravine provided natural concealment, its steep walls making it difficult to approach without being seen or heard, but it also limited their escape routes. Mia scanned the terrain, her trained eyes identifying potential weak points in their position. A narrow trail led further into the forest, winding through thick undergrowth that could slow their pursuers but would also impede their own movement. To the left, the ravine narrowed into a bottleneck, creating a natural choke point, a potential ambush site, if she could position herself correctly. She filed these details away, her mind running through possible scenarios. Her mission was clear: keep Leila safe and neutralize the threat. Leila shifted slightly in Mia's arms, her small voice breaking the silence. Mom, why are they after us? Did we do something wrong? The innocence in her question cut through Mia's resolve like a knife. She looked down at her daughter, brushing a stray curl from her face. No, sweetheart, she said softly, her voice steady but warm. We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes bad people try to hurt others because they think they can, but we're not going to let them win, okay? Leila nodded, her trust in her mother absolute, though the fear in her eyes remained. Mia's attention snapped back to the forest above as she heard the faint sound of voices. The men were regrouping. She strained to pick up their words, but the distance muffled the conversation. Still, their presence was unmistakable. They were fanning out, their movements calculated and deliberate. Mia's jaw tightened. They were hunting her like prey, but they had underestimated her. She wasn't just a mother on the run, she was a trained operative, and she had no intention of letting them corner her. She shifted her position, peering up toward the ridge of the ravine. The foliage above moved slightly, and she caught a glimpse of a shadow, a man moving cautiously along the edge, scanning the ground below. He was alone, likely acting as a scout to locate their position. Mia's mind raced. She needed to act quickly before he spotted them. She turned to Leila, lowering her voice to a whisper. Stay here and don't move. No matter what happens, stay quiet. I'll be right back. Leila's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded, clutching Mia's hand briefly before letting go. Mia moved silently, her body low to the ground as she climbed out of the alcove and into the shadows of the ravine. She kept her steps light, avoiding loose rocks and twigs that could give away her position. The man above was focused on scanning the area ahead, unaware of her presence. Mia's training kicked in, every movement deliberate and precise. She closed the distance between them, her heart steady as she prepared to strike. When she was within range, she sprang into action. Her hand shot out, grabbing the man's ankle and yanking him off balance. He let out a startled grunt as he fell, tumbling down the slope and landing hard on the rocky ground below. Mia was on him in an instant, her knee pressing into his chest as she pinned him. She clamped her hand over his mouth to silence him, her other hand gripping his wrist to prevent him from reaching for a weapon. Who sent you? Mia hissed, her voice low but filled with authority. The man's eyes widened, his breathing ragged as he struggled beneath her. He didn't answer, his defiance evident in the set of his jaw. Mia increased the pressure on his chest, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You've already lost. Tell me who you're working for, or I'll make sure you don't walk out of this forest. The man hesitated, his resolve wavering under her unrelenting gaze. Finally, he muttered through her hand, his voice muffled but clear enough. You don't know who you're messing with. Mia's eyes narrowed. She removed her hand slightly, just enough for him to speak. Try me, she said coldly. The man spat out a bitter laugh, his bravado returning despite his vulnerable position. You think you're the hero here? You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. They don't care about you, they want what you know. His words sent a chill through Mia. What she knew. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the meaning behind his cryptic statement. Before she could press him further, a crackle of static interrupted the moment a radio clipped to the man's vest. Status report. Have you found them? The voice on the other end was sharp and authoritative. Mia's eyes darted to the radio, her mind calculating her next move. If she didn't respond, they would know something was wrong and send reinforcements. If she did, she risked exposing her position. She made her decision in an instant. She grabbed the radio and pressed the button, mimicking the man's voice as best she could. Negative. Still searching the eastern ridge, she said, her tone clipped and professional. There was a pause on the other end before the voice replied, "Copy that. Stay alert. They can't have gone far." Mia released the button, her heart pounding as she tossed the radio aside. She turned her attention back to the man beneath her, her expression steely. "You just bought yourself a little more time," she said. With a swift, calculated strike, she knocked him unconscious, ensuring he wouldn't pose a threat. She quickly tied his hands and feet with strips of his own gear, leaving him secured but alive. Mia returned to the alcove, her movements swift but silent. Leila's face lit up with relief when she saw her mother, though the tension in her small frame was still evident. "Are we okay?" she whispered. Mia nodded, pulling her daughter into a brief hug. "We're okay for now," she said, "but we need to keep moving. It's not safe here." As they climbed out of the ravine, Mia's mind raced. The man's words echoed in her head. "They want what you know." What could he have meant? She hadn't been active in the field for years, and she had deliberately severed ties with her past life to protect herself and Leila. What could possibly be so important that they were willing to go to these lengths to find her? The questions swirled in her mind, but there was no time for answers. Survival came first. The forest opened up slightly as they moved further east, the trees thinning to reveal a small clearing. Mia stopped at the edge, scanning the area for any signs of movement. It seemed empty, but her instincts told her to stay cautious. She led Leila through the clearing, her eyes constantly darting to the shadows for any sign of danger. They reached the other side without incident, but Mia's sense of unease only grew. The men were still out there, and it was only a matter of time before they regrouped. As they continued, Mia spotted a structure in the distance, a small, abandoned ranger station, its weathered walls barely visible through the trees. It was risky, but it could provide a temporary stronghold. She guided Leila toward it, her pace quickening as the sound of distant voices reached her ears once again. The men were closing in. They reached the station a few minutes later, Mia carefully pushing the door open and scanning the interior. The building was empty, its contents long since stripped away by time and neglect. Still, it offered shelter and a defensible position. Mia ushered Leila inside and secured the door behind them, using an old piece of furniture to block it. "Stay here," Mia said, kneeling in front of Leila. "I'm going to check the windows and make sure we're safe." Leila nodded, her trust in her mother unwavering despite the fear in her eyes. Mia moved quickly, inspecting the building's perimeter and noting potential entry points. The station had seen better days, but it would have to do. As she finished her sweep, Mia heard a sound that sent a chill down her spine, the faint but unmistakable hum of a drone. She looked out the window, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a small device hovering above the treetops. The men were using technology to track them now, escalating their efforts. Mia's mind raced as she considered her options. They couldn't stay here, but escaping undetected would be nearly impossible with the drone overhead. Her gaze fell on an old storage closet in the corner of the room. She opened it, finding a few rusted tools and a coil of wire. An idea began to form. If she could disable the drone, it might buy them the time they needed to escape. She grabbed the wire and fashioned a makeshift slingshot, using a piece of broken wood as the base. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Mia moved to the window, her movements slow and deliberate as she aimed the slingshot at the drone. She waited for it to hover closer, her breathing steady as she lined up her shot. With a swift pull, she released the wire, sending it hurtling through the air. The wire struck the drone, tangling in its rotors and causing it to sputter and crash to the ground. A small explosion of sparks marked its demise. The sound of the crash would undoubtedly alert the men, but it was a necessary risk. Mia turned to Leila, her expression determined. We need to move. Now, she grabbed her daughter's hand, leading her out the back of the station and into the forest once more. The chase was far from over, but Mia knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going down without a fight. Mia and Leila plunged deeper into the forest, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth as twilight began to descend over the park. The once vibrant greens of the trees darkened into shadowy silhouettes, and the air grew cooler, carrying with it an eerie stillness. Every step Mia took was calculated, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any signs of pursuit. She could feel Leila's small hand gripping hers tightly, the girl's trust in her mother both a source of strength and a reminder of the stakes. Mia's body moved instinctively, her training guiding her actions as her mind raced to stay ahead of their pursuers. The crash of the drone had brought them a brief reprieve, but the enemy was still close. They would regroup and escalate their efforts. The faint sound of voices filtered through the trees, low and sharp, carried by the shifting breeze. Mia slowed her pace, guiding Leila off the main path and into the underbrush. The thick foliage scratched against their clothes as they moved, but Mia welcomed the cover it provided. She crouched low, pulling Leila down with her as she peered through the dense greenery. In the distance, she spotted the faint glow of flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. The men were sweeping the area, their movements purposeful and coordinated. They were closing in. Mia pressed her finger to her lips, signaling Leila to stay silent. The girl nodded, her wide eyes glinting with fear but also resolve. Mia leaned close, whispering in her ear, "We're going to play a quiet game, okay? Just follow me and stay as still as you can." Leila nodded again, clutching her mother's arm tightly as they moved deeper into the forest. Mia's mind worked quickly, mapping out their next steps. She needed to create distance, but she also needed to slow the men down. Running blindly through the woods would only tire them out and make them more vulnerable. She had to turn the terrain into an advantage. Ahead, the ground sloped downward into a natural depression filled with fallen trees and thick vegetation. Mia led Leila toward it, using the uneven ground to mask their movements. As they descended, Mia's sharp eyes scanned the etching for anything she could use. Her gaze fell on a cluster of large rocks near the base of the slope. They were scattered haphazardly, their jagged edges partially obscured by moss and leaves. An idea began to form in her mind, a way to slow the men's progress and potentially neutralize some of them without direct confrontation. Mia turned to Leila, crouching down to meet her eye level. "I need you to stay right here for a moment," she whispered, her voice calm but firm. "Don't move, and don't make a sound. I'll be right back." Leila looked hesitant, but she nodded, trusting her mother implicitly. Mia gave her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before slipping away, moving quickly but silently toward the rocks. She began to gather smaller stones, piling them in strategic locations around the depression. With practiced efficiency, she constructed makeshift tripwires using vines and branches, anchoring them between trees and low-hanging brush. It was a crude setup, but it would create enough chaos to disrupt the men's pursuit. Mia worked quickly, her hands steady even as her mind remained hyper-alert to the sounds of the forest. She could hear the men's voices growing louder, their flashlights bobbing closer as they navigated the uneven terrain. As she finished setting the last tripwire, Mia heard a sharp whistle cut through the air, a signal between the men. Her heart sank as she realized they were spreading out, attempting to flank her position. She needed to move, and fast. She darted back to where she had left Leila, finding her daughter exactly where she had told her to stay, crouched low and motionless. Mia felt a swell of pride at Leila's courage, but there was no time to dwell on it. "Come on," Mia whispered, taking Leila's hand. We need to move. They began to climb out of the depression, using the rocks and tree roots for support. Behind them, Mia heard the first sound of impact, a startled cry, followed by the crash of branches as one of the men tripped over her setup. The noise was followed by shouted curses and the sound of another man stumbling. Mia allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The traps were working, but they wouldn't hold the men for long. As they reached the top of the slope, Mia paused to catch her breath. She glanced back, her sharp eyes picking out the faint movement of the men below. Two of them were tangled in the tripwires, struggling to free themselves, while a third carefully picked his way through the obstacles. The fourth man, the leader, was nowhere to be seen. Mia's brow furrowed. She didn't like it. He was too experienced to be caught off guard by something as simple as tripwires. She scanned the surrounding forest, her instincts telling her he was nearby, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Mia tightened her grip on Leila's hand, her voice a low whisper. "Stay close to me no matter what happens. We're going to keep moving." Leila nodded, her trust unwavering despite the fear in her eyes. They began to move again, this time heading toward the edge of the park where Mia knew there was a shallow creek that could help mask their trail. The sound of water would also provide cover, making it harder for the men to track them by sound. As they approached the creek, Mia's ears picked up a faint rustling behind them. She stopped abruptly, pulling Leila close and motioning for her to stay silent. The rustling grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of a weapon being cocked. Mia's body tensed, her mind racing. They had been found. A low voice called out from the shadows. "Stop right there." Mia turned slowly, her body positioned protectively in front of Leila. The leader stepped out from behind a tree, his gun trained on her. His expression was cold and calculating, his eyes locked on Mia with a mixture of caution and disdain. "You've been making this far more difficult than it needed to be," he said, his voice calm but edged with menace. Mia didn't respond, her mind working furiously to assess the situation. The man was alone, which meant the others were likely still dealing with her traps. She had an advantage, but it was slim. Leila clung to her arm, her small body trembling against Mia's side. Mia could feel her daughter's fear, but she couldn't let it distract her. She needed to act. "Let her go," Mia said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "She has nothing to do with this." The man smirked, lowering the gun slightly but keeping it trained on Mia. "Oh, she has everything to do with this," he said. "You think we're here just for you? No, this is about leverage. You've made a lot of enemies, Mia Johnson, and they all know exactly how to hit you where it hurts." Mia's jaw tightened. Whoever had sent these men knew more about her than she had anticipated. They weren't just targeting her, they were targeting Leila to get to her. The realization sent a wave of cold fury through her. She had spent years building a new life, keeping her daughter safe and far from the shadows of her past. And now, those shadows had found her. The leader took a step closer, his gun still raised. "Here's how this is going to work," he said. "You're going to come with us quietly. The kid stays here. Once we've got what we need, she'll be fine. No one has to get hurt." His tone was casual, almost bored, as if he were offering a deal she couldn't refuse. Mia's mind raced. She could see the arrogance in his stance, the way he assumed he had already won. It was a weakness, and she intended to exploit it. Without warning, she moved. Her hand shot out, grabbing a handful of dirt and throwing it into his face. He stumbled back with a curse, raising his hands to shield his eyes. Mia didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, disarming him with a quick strike to his wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, and she kicked it away, her movements fluid and precise. The man recovered quickly, his fists coming up in a defensive stance. He was strong and well-trained, but Mia's experience and determination gave her the edge. They traded blows, their movements a blur of calculated strikes and counters. Mia's focus was razor-sharp, her body moving on instinct as she exploited every opening in his defense. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. Mia landed a final decisive blow, sending the man crashing to the ground. He groaned, his body limp but alive. Mia didn't waste time. She grabbed Leila's hand and ran, her heart pounding as they disappeared into the forest once more. The fight had bought them time, but the danger was far from over. The men would regroup, and the hunt would continue. But Mia wasn't going to stop. Not until she had ensured Leila's safety and put an end to the threat once and for all. Mia's breath was steady as she pushed forward through the thick forest, her grip firm on Leila's hand. The air around them felt heavy, laden with the tension of the pursuit. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, her senses heightened to every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows. They were running out of places to hide, and the men pursuing them were closing the distance. Mia knew this was heading toward a final confrontation, one she couldn't avoid. Her mind was focused on one goal: to protect her daughter, no matter what it cost. The forest began to thin, and ahead she saw a clearing bathed in the faint silver light of the rising moon. At its center stood a decrepit observation tower, a relic from when the park had been used for forestry research. Its rusted metal frame rose into the night sky, offering both a vantage point and a potential trap. Mia quickly assessed the situation. The tower's elevated platform could give her a clear view of the surrounding area, but it was also exposed, and if the men spotted her, it could become a cage. "Leila," Mia said softly, crouching down to look her daughter in the eyes. "We're going to climb up that tower. It's going to be high, but I'll be with you the whole time. Do you trust me?" Leila nodded, though her small face was pale with fear. "I trust you, Mum," she whispered. Mia smiled, brushing a hand over her daughter's cheek. "You're so brave, sweetheart. Stay close to me and we'll get through this together." They reached the base of the tower, its structure groaning softly in the wind. Mia glanced back into the forest, catching a glimpse of movement flashlights slicing through the darkness. The men were close, their voices carrying faintly on the breeze. Mia didn't hesitate. She boosted Leila onto the first rung of the ladder, climbing up behind her and keeping one arm protectively around her daughter's waist as they ascended. The metal creaked beneath their weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet night. When they reached the top, Mia pulled Leila onto the platform, her eyes immediately scanning the horizon. The elevated position gave her a clear view of the forest below. She could see the men emerging from the trees, their flashlights bobbing as they spread out to search the clearing. There were 4 of them now, including the leader she had fought earlier. He moved with cold precision, his commands sharp and deliberate. They were closing in, but Mia wasn't done fighting. She crouched low on the platform, pulling Leila into the shadows of the tower's rusted railing. "Stay here," Mia whispered. "I need to set something up, but I'll be right back. Don't move and don't make a sound." Leila nodded, her wide eyes glistening with trust and fear. Mia gave her a quick hug before moving to the edge of the platform, her mind racing through her options. The tower's structure was old but sturdy, its beams crisscrossing in a lattice that provided multiple points of support and potential for sabotage. Mia's gaze fell on a loose bolt near one of the main supports. An idea began to form, risky but effective. She quickly searched the platform, finding a length of frayed rope and a rusted metal pole left behind by whoever had abandoned the tower. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Mia worked quickly, tying the rope around the pole and securing it to one of the beams. She tested the tension, ensuring it would hold. Her plan was simple but dangerous. If the men tried to climb the tower, she would disable the structure, forcing it to collapse and taking them out with it. It was a last resort, but she had no other choice. Her focus sharpened as she finished the setup, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. Below, the men were converging on the tower. The leader raised his hand, signaling for them to spread out. "She's here," he said, his voice carrying through the clearing. "Check the perimeter. Don't let her get away this time." The others nodded, their movements quick and methodical as they surrounded the base of the tower. Mia's heart pounded as she crouched in the shadows, her body coiled like a spring ready to act. One of the men reached the ladder and began to climb, his flashlight casting harsh beams of light across the metal rungs. Mia waited, her breathing slow and controlled as she prepared to strike. When the man's head appeared above the platform, she moved with lightning speed. Grabbing the pole, she swung it with precision, striking him across the face. He let out a grunt of pain, losing his grip and falling backward, his body crashing onto the ground below. The noise drew the attention of the other men, their flashlights snapping toward the tower. "She's up there," one of them shouted. The leader barked an order, his tone sharp. "Take her alive if you can. Shoot if you have to." The remaining two men began to climb, their movements quick and purposeful. Mia tightened her grip on the pole, her mind racing. She needed to delay them long enough to execute her plan. The first man reached the platform, his gun drawn. Mia was ready. She lunged forward, disarming him with a swift strike to his wrist and following it up with a sharp kick to his chest. He staggered backward, his body slamming into the railing with a clang. Before he could recover, Mia delivered a final blow, rendering him unconscious. The second man was close behind, his movements cautious as he advanced toward her. Mia sidestepped his attack, using his momentum against him to throw him off balance. They grappled briefly, their bodies locked in a struggle for dominance. The man was strong, but Mia's training gave her the edge. She twisted his arm, forcing him to drop his weapon, and delivered a decisive strike to his temple. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The leader, still below, shouted in frustration. "Hold your position," he ordered. His voice was filled with anger, but also something else, uncertainty. He hadn't expected this level of resistance, and it was throwing him off balance. Mia seized the opportunity, calling down to him. "It's over," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "You've failed. Leave now, or you won't walk out of here." The leader stepped into the light, his expression hard. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his tone laced with venom. "This isn't just about you. It's about sending a message. People like you think you can escape the past, but you can't. There's always a reckoning." Mia's jaw tightened. She could see the arrogance in his stance, the way he carried himself like he was invincible. But she knew better. Everyone had a weakness, and she was going to find his. She moved to the edge of the platform, her eyes locked on his. "You're right about one thing," she said. "There is a reckoning, and it starts now." With that, she grabbed the rope and pulled with all her strength. The tower groaned in protest as the weakened beam gave way, the structure shuddering beneath her. The leader's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "No," he shouted, but it was too late. The tower collapsed with a deafening roar, its metal frame crumpling like a house of cards. Mia grabbed Leila, shielding her as the platform buckled and fell. She had positioned them near the edge, allowing them to jump free just before the tower hit the ground. They landed hard but safely, rolling to absorb the impact. Behind them, the twisted remains of the tower lay in a heap, smoke and dust rising into the night sky. Mia pulled Leila close, checking her for injuries. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice urgent. Leila nodded, her small body trembling but unharmed. "I'm okay, Mum," she said. Mia hugged her tightly, relief flooding through her. In the wreckage, the leader groaned, pinned beneath a mangled beam. He glared at Mia, his defiance undimmed despite his defeat. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice weak but venomous. Mia stepped toward him, her expression steely. "Yes, it is," she said. "Stay down and don't follow us again." Without another word, she turned and led Leila into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. The danger was over for now, but Mia knew this was only the beginning. Whoever had sent these men wouldn't stop, but neither would she. She was ready for whatever came next. For Leila's sake, she would always be ready. The forest was quiet again, the echoes of the collapsing tower fading into the distance as Mia guided Leila through the thick undergrowth. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silvery beams of light that filtered through the branches, painting dappled patterns on the ground. Every step Mia took was deliberate, her senses sharp and attuned to the surroundings. Though the immediate danger seemed to have passed, she knew better than to let her guard down. The men might have been neutralized for now, but whoever had sent them wouldn't stop. They would regroup, recalibrate, and come after her again. The stakes were too high for her to assume otherwise. Leila clung to her mother's hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around Mia's. Despite the adrenaline that still pulsed through her veins, Mia's heart ached as she glanced down at her daughter. Leila had been brave, more brave than any 8-year-old should ever have to be, but the night's events had left their mark. The fear in her wide eyes and the trembling in her small frame were unmistakable. Mia wanted nothing more than to wrap her arms around her daughter and tell her everything would be okay, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Not yet. "Mom," Leila said softly, her voice trembling. "Are those men gone? Are we safe now?" Mia stopped, crouching down to meet Leila's gaze. She placed her hands gently on her daughter's shoulders, her touch steady and reassuring. "We're safe for now," she said, her voice firm but calm. "But we need to keep moving, okay? I know you're tired, sweetheart, but you've been so strong. Can you do this for me a little longer?" Leila nodded, her trust in her mother absolute, even as tears welled in her eyes. Mia pulled her into a brief hug, whispering, "I'm so proud of you. We're going to get through this. I promise." With that, Mia rose to her feet, guiding Leila through the forest once more. Her mind was already calculating their next move. The tower had been a temporary reprieve, a tactical win in an ongoing war. But she needed a longer-term solution. The men who had pursued her weren't amateurs, they were part of something larger, something more dangerous. Their leader's words echoed in her mind. There's always a reckoning. Whoever had sent them knew about her past, and they wanted something from her. The question was, what? Mia's thoughts turned to her old life, the years she had spent working in the shadows as part of an elite covert operations unit. She had left that world behind to protect Leila, severing ties with everyone and everything connected to it. But it was clear now that her past had caught up with her. The question wasn't whether she could keep running, it was how she could fight back. She needed to uncover the truth behind the attack and dismantle the threat at its source. Anything less would leave her and Leila vulnerable. As they moved through the forest, Mia spotted a faint light in the distance, flickering through the trees. She paused, her body tensing as she assessed the situation. The light appeared to come from a small cabin, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. It was risky to approach, but they needed shelter, and the cabin might offer a chance to regroup. Mia crouched down beside Leila, whispering, "Stay close to me and stay quiet. We're going to check this out together." They approached the cabin cautiously, Mia's senses on high alert. She circled the structure, peering through the windows and listening for any sounds of movement inside. The cabin appeared abandoned, its interior dusty and cluttered with old furniture and tools. Satisfied that it was safe, Mia led Leila inside, securing the door behind them with a rusted latch. The space was cramped and smelled of mildew, but it was dry and defensible. For the first time in hours, Mia allowed herself to exhale. She sat Leila down on an old couch, brushing stray leaves from her daughter's hair. "We're going to rest here for a little while," she said, her voice soft. "You can close your eyes if you want. I'll keep watch." Leila hesitated, her small hands clutching the fabric of Mia's jacket. "Will you stay right here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Leila's cheek. "I'll be right here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." As Leila curled up on the couch, her exhaustion finally overtaking her, Mia moved to the window and peered out into the night. The forest was still, the only sounds the distant chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. But Mia knew better than to assume the danger was gone. The men might have been incapacitated, but they weren't the real threat. They were just the tip of the spear, a weapon wielded by someone else, and that someone would want answers about what had gone wrong. Mia's mind raced as she considered her options. She needed information, and she needed it fast. Her gaze fell on the small satchel she had taken from one of the men during their earlier encounter. She opened it, her fingers sifting through its contents. Inside, she found a burner phone, a small notepad with hastily scrawled instructions, and a folded map. The map caught her attention. It was marked with a series of coordinates, one of which matched the location of the park. The others were scattered across the region, suggesting a broader network of activity. The notepad contained only cryptic phrases: priority target, secure the package, and report to base. None of it provided immediate clarity, but it confirmed what Mia already suspected. This wasn't a simple operation. It was part of something larger, something organized. The phone, however, offered the most potential. If she could access its data or trace its origin, it might lead her to the people behind the attack. Mia turned it over in her hands, her mind already formulating a plan. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the cabin door. Mia froze, her body tensing as her instincts screamed at her to stay quiet. She moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing. Then a figure stepped into the moonlight, a woman, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. She was dressed in plain clothes, her expression cautious but not hostile. "Mia Johnson?" The woman called out, her voice low but clear. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk." Mia's eyes narrowed as she studied the stranger. There was something familiar about her, though she couldn't place it. She stepped back from the window, her mind racing. Was this another trap? Or was this woman truly here to help? Mia opened the door just enough to speak, her voice firm. "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman hesitated, her eyes meeting Mia's. "My name is Elena Carter," she said. "I used to work with you. And I think we have a common enemy." The name hit Mia like a jolt. She remembered Elena, an intelligence analyst who had been part of several operations Mia had led years ago. But what was she doing here? And how has she found her? Mia stepped outside, closing the door behind her to keep Leila safe. "You have 2 minutes to explain," she said, her tone cold. Elena nodded, her expression serious. "I know what happened tonight. The men who came after you, they're part of a private paramilitary group. They're being funded by someone with deep pockets and a grudge against you. I don't know all the details yet, but I've been tracking their movements for months. When I saw your name surface as a target, I knew I had to warn you. Mia's eyes narrowed. Why would you help me? We haven't spoken in years. Elena hesitated, then said, Because I owe you. You saved my life once, and I never forgot that. Now I'm trying to return the favor. Mia studied Elena for a long moment, her instincts warring with her need for answers. Finally, she said, If you're lying, I'll know. And if this is a trap, you won't get a second chance. Elena nodded solemnly. I wouldn't expect anything less. Mia let her inside, her mind racing with new possibilities. Whoever had sent the men after her had underestimated her resolve and her ability to find allies. As she looked at Leila sleeping peacefully on the couch, Mia felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking the fight to those who had threatened her family, and she wouldn't stop until the threat was eliminated once and for all.